Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don's sitting in the What If machine today and flying it solo, but actually going back a little bit in time into our archives to provide today's episode. We haven't been able to gather the team. A lot of things are going on for the team to get the recordings done that we had originally planned for this week. So this was a great opportunity to do something I was planning to do anyway, and that was to go back and pick up a series that we started for our patrons over on the patron feed last summer, the summer of 2021, that we didn't get quite finished, but we're intended to pick it back up. So I thought this would be a good chance to bring that back over to the main feed because we'll be finishing it up here on the main feed. And the subject of that series is a very, very, very large event in history. It's an epoch type event in history, and that's the late Bronze Age collapse. The type of thing that is so big you really can't do it justice in one episode. And we had planned out actually a 10 episode series on that, and we'll do probably that many episodes scattered across and among our episodes as we move forward over the next couple of months. And so, just to set the stage, what you're about to hear now are back-to-back the first and second episode from that series. So the first episode really serves as an extended what did. It's such a large event that we need to set that up well to understand what actually did happen in history. And then the second part, again, these will be back-to-back today, is actually episode number 2, which is the first of the focused explorations on a what if. Because this particular event in history has a number of different areas of impact. It was a widespread event. It wasn't localized. And it has a broad reach in terms of the potential what if events. Again, that's why it deserves a series versus a single episode. So I hope that you find today's episode helpful. We'll come back and provide episodes, the subsequent episodes, including episode 3, which was already recorded, and then the ones that will follow after that will also include the team and maybe even expanded team, because I know we have a lot of listeners that have a lot of interest and expertise, so to speak, in this area, so I'm looking forward to including them in the process. So enough of me talking. So here you go. Here are episodes 1 and 2 from the late Bronze Age collapse series. Hope you enjoy them. The goal today, I already did a little bit of a why type of thing on the main podcast feed, so I don't really want to repeat too much of that today. What I really wanted to focus on today in this episode is actually providing some of the rest of the historical background. So it's a little bit more about what is the late Bronze Age, what is the late Bronze Age collapse, but more importantly, focusing a little bit today on the potential causes of the, and I'm going to use the word event here. Event is actually almost too small of a term. It's almost too small of a noun to be applicable to what we're talking about here. As we're going to discover, the more that we unfold this in terms of looking at the historical what ifs, even as we talk about the historical what did here, that's continuing to set up the series, the what ifs, we'll find that this is a major, major event in history. And again, I'm somewhat surprised the more people that I talk to who I know are savvy when it comes to their history because of when it is, in terms of history, in terms of the areas that we often spend time talking about and being exposed to. I think it's one of the more overlooked major events in history. And we'll talk a little bit about even today when we're talking about the cause as to why it's overlooked, partly because there's still a lot of disagreement among historians and archaeologists about the event itself, but even more importantly about what the actual causation of the event is. And so again, today's episode is not going to go down any of the historical what ifs. That's something that we're going to reserve for the series of episodes that we have where we look at individual elements of the what ifs, because they are, again, widespread, far-reaching in their scope in terms of not only the areas that were impacted during the particular time of the event of the late Bronze Age collapse, but also how history would flow in general and how it would flow in very specific ways from that point on for the what ifs. As we often do here on A Fork in Time, it's necessary for us to establish a good, solid what did foundation in order to be able to pivot off of that for the what ifs. And so that's going to be the purpose of today's episode, is to establish a little bit more of the setting for the late Bronze Age, and the setting for the particular event of the collapse itself, talking about some of the actual things that occurred during the collapse, and really focus on some of the theories and hypotheses that have been developed around what is the cause of the collapse. Because as we begin to talk about the historical what ifs, being able to understand how we might have been able to avoid the causal factors is obviously an important part of that, but it also plays into understanding what happened, and thus, if we look at a historical what if, what did not happen. So I hope that this episode today provides a good foundation, a good start, so that as we go down each of the individual what if episodes that follow, we can refer back to this and have a good solid basis and not have to repeat that material over and over again as we're looking at the historical what ifs. So for the episode today, we're primarily going to focus on four things. One is establishing the scene or the setting as we get to the late Bronze Age. We're going to establish what is the nature and the component of the Bronze Age, which becomes so important in establishing what it is, but also what happens during the collapse. We're going to talk about the particular players, if you will, the empires, civilizations, the other people groups that are impacted by the collapse. In other words, what empires collapse, what civilization collapse, sort of what was and then what is not is an important part of that. And of course, as I mentioned before, we're going to focus on the causal factors and the fact that there are a number of different causal factors that we have to consider together. So those are going to be our four broad areas that we focus on today. And so let's quit talking about it. Let's start doing it. So again, the first of those is actually talking about what is the Bronze Age? What is the characteristic of the Bronze Age? Generally defined by historians, it's a prehistoric period. The term prehistoric there meaning before writing. Although during parts of the Bronze Age, particularly the latter portions of the Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age, something we're going to be talking a lot about, there is some what's known as proto-writing, or the beginning of the types of things that produce written records. But for most of the Bronze Age, we do not have the benefit of writing that we at least not writing that we have possession of today or that we understand today. And so it falls in that period of being prehistoric. So the things that are recorded about the events that occurred during there, the civilizations that exist, are all the result of archaeological discoveries or other traditions, legends, other things that are carried down in various forms, since it's not overlapping during the period where there's extant writing that's going on during that particular point of time. But it is the period of time that sees the rise of a number of civilizations. And we see that obviously with the development of writing. We see that in moving towards agricultural and city-state types of scenarios where it's not small groups of people that are spread apart in tribal areas or in small settlements, but we have the rise of larger city-type structures, the city-states that we see in Mesopotamia, and we have the rise of civilizations that are brought about by the domestication of animals, but also by the actual use of agriculture intentionally moving towards farming and being able to support larger populations and to support city-type environments, more urban type of environments, because of the ability to produce enough foodstuffs for a mass of people, for larger populations. And so the Bronze Age is characterized by the fact that it's the rise of the early civilizations that we recognize or that we know from history pretty well, particularly those in Mesopotamia, but also the rise of Egypt and the rise of other major civilizations that are beginning to look like, in terms of technology and in terms of their organization, a little bit more like what we're accustomed today. Again, it's called the Bronze Age because it's all about bronze. And bronze, of course, is not a naturally occurring element. It's not a single element, but it is, meteorologically, it is something that could actually be put together that is primarily composed of copper. And so while iron is fairly abundant, it has a very high melting point. And as a result, it's very difficult to work and to fashion iron, even though it's more prevalent in nature. However, copper combined with either 10 to 15% tin or other metals can actually be fashioned into a more durable metal that is known as bronze. And so it takes copper, which has a very low melting point and smelting point, and adding to that the primary element that's normally used is tin. Combining those two things together enable the production of bronze. And bronze can be fashioned into a number of different artifacts and tools, but it can also be fashioned into weapons that are able to have a sharper, more durable edge, that are more durable in terms of being able to survive over periods of time and maintain those edges. And so bronze becomes the technology not only of tools and of decoration, which it still is even today, but it's also important because of what it enables from both a technology and a military standpoint in terms of the development of weapons and other elements that are based on metal that are not simply based upon stone. So the Bronze Age sees the rise of civilization and technology that's built around the bronze technology. And the bronze technology is the fashion of metalworking that combines copper along with tin and with other metals to be able to produce something that is durable and much more effective than just simple stone. So the approximate timing on the Bronze Age, roughly speaking, the early Bronze Age beginning about 3000 BC and carrying down through the Middle Bronze Age and then to the Late Bronze Age, which is identified being around the period of 1200 to around 1000 BC. So when we're talking about the Late Bronze Age here, we're talking about moving towards the time, and again, the date that we're going to sort of settle around as we talk about the Late Bronze Age and the Late Bronze Age collapse is going to be the period of time from about 1200 BC to about 1150 BC. So when we're talking about the Bronze Age, obviously I've just described a little bit of what that is about. The Late Bronze Age being the latter period of that, and the collapse actually occurring during that period of time, a space of about maybe 100 to 150 years, roughly around a loose date. We'll use 1200 BC for that. And so, again, the Bronze Age is that. So what is the Late Bronze Age setting that leads up to the Late Bronze Age collapse? So the setting that we find at the end of the Bronze Age is actually come to be better understood by historians and archaeologists, particularly in the last 30 to 40 years, as being civilizations that we knew existed, but we've learned some things about the interactions among those civilizations, which has brought even more to light as a result of recent archaeology. But the time in question for the Late Bronze Age, and thus the period of time as we're leading up to the collapse, is we have a number of large cultures and civilizations that have come to be and are quite dominant. So these include the Greek kingdoms in Mycenae and even the Minoan area. We'll distinguish with those a little bit more as we talk about the what-ifs that relate to what would have happened with some of these Greek areas if there had not been a Late Bronze Age collapse. We have the Kassites in Babylonia, which have taken over to a great degree from the Sumerians, where the culture had arisen there. We have the Hittite Empire in Anatolia. Anatolia being the area that we think of as being modern Turkey, the large central area there of Asia Minor that's ruled by the Hittites, and they cover a very large territorial swath. We also have the New Kingdom period in Egypt. So Egypt is a thriving civilization along the Nile, what we think of as being traditional Egypt. Of course, the building of the pyramids and the other things have happened thousands of years before, but we still have a very bright, vibrant Egyptian empire and Egyptian civilization at the time that we draw towards the end of the Bronze Age. We also have Ugaritic society. Ugarit is a city, primarily in what we think of as being the very far north of modern day Lebanon, also into Syria, the area that we think of later as being Assyria. And then we have various states in the Levant. The Levant being the area occupied, the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine today. So we have the Amorite states that are there as well, and all the particular other smaller people groups and smaller empires and areas of civilization that are existing. But the big players are the Mycenaean Greeks, the Egyptians, the Hittites, and then the Kassites, along with the Ugaritic states. These are the five really large civilization or cultures that exist as we're drawing up to the period here at the end of the Bronze Age. So that sets the stage for when is and what is the Bronze Age, particularly the Late Bronze Age. And so now that sets us up to what is the collapse. And collapse is actually probably about the most appropriate word that I can imagine that would be used. This is not just an event. This is not just an isolated thing that happens in a very short period of time or to a very limited geographic scope as we draw towards the end of the Late Bronze Age here. This is a very significant event that is widespread in terms of geography, certainly is widespread in terms of impact, and is widespread in terms of how it's going to impact history moving forward, which is what sets it up so nicely for what we do here on A Fork in Time, which is talking about what are the potential historical what-ifs of there not being a collapse. And so moving forward, we don't want to keep having to use the very long description, Late Bronze Age collapse. We know we're talking about this particular period of time, the Late Bronze Age, and we talk about the collapse. We're going to be talking about this event, big scale, mega scale event, which is comprised of a series of events that happened during this particular time frame. Again, placing that on a timeline, the timeline that we want to put in place here is going to be between approximately 1200 BC and 1150 BC. We'll see that it doesn't happen all in the space of 1 year, and it's spread out a little bit because of the geographic scope of what happens here. But a handy date that you might use to sort of think about it, sort of in the middle of that, which is 1177. And we might use that because of a historian and archaeologist Eric Klein, who's the author of a book, a very good book on the subject I would highly recommend. That's 1177 BC. That would be the year that civilization collapsed. And he uses that just for a number of different reasons as a representative potential year that sort of would represent the big epoch year of what's going on with the collapse. So when we say collapse, what happened? Well, we're talking about actually the destruction of virtually every city, port, or major collection of peoples all the way from Asia Minor, the area in Anatolia, and along what we think of today as the Turkish coast near the Aegean, on down through the eastern coast of the Mediterranean and all the way down to Egypt. The end result is, after the collapse, almost every major city is burned, razed, or destroyed, with many of them never actually being occupied again. The destruction here is not just physical in the sense of warfare or the actual destruction of property, but it's also the fall of civilizations, of trade relationships, and of cultures in such a way that there literally is a complete collapse of these major civilizations that have been dominant, in some cases not just for hundreds of years, but for 1,000 years or so. It's the collapse of most of the known world in the area of the Aegean, the Mediterranean, Egypt, and the Near/Middle East. Everything that is known collapses. And that collapse happens in a very short period of time, and it is a complete collapse. Political systems, cultural connections, trade, everything comes to a halt. And so the collapse is substantial. Collapse is the right term to describe it. It's not just a series of isolated events that happen around the same time. There's a complete collapse. One of the interesting things that has also come along, I mentioned sort of understanding better about where things stood for the Late Bronze Age, is in 1982 there was actually the discovery of a shipwreck, a ship that had sunk that was off the southwestern coast of Turkey. And what's important about this vessel, which is dated somewhere around 1300 BC, so about 100 years before the Late Bronze Age collapse, is what was found on the vessel. It was clearly a larger vessel, a vessel that was capable of traveling over larger distances there in the Mediterranean, so it was not just a small coastal type of trade vessel. But what was found on that vessel, as Eric Klein describes it, this is part of what he also talks about in his book 1177, is that it's just a quote-unquote incredible assortment of goods. What is very clear from what is found in the vessel is that the trade that was going on and the trade that is represented by this shipwreck, and thus probably represents that there were many other ships like this that were engaged at the trade at the time, is the number of items and where they're coming from and what their sources are, and how they must have interrelated with each other, indicates that this period of time of the Late Bronze Age was not just when those civilizations and those empires that I mentioned were in a position of power, but that they were trading with each other and were interacting with each other in a scope that really wasn't understood before. In fact, one of the most interesting things about the cargo that's found on board the vessel actually speaks directly to the fact that we're in the Bronze Age. Remember that I talked about that bronze is the result of taking copper plus tin, and the ratio there is about 10 to 1, give or take, with 10 representing about 10% of the composition of bronze, the rest of it being copper. So in the primary cargo hold of this ship is found 10 tons of copper from Cyprus and a ton of tin, in addition to all types of other finished and raw items from a number of different areas, not just around the area there around the Aegean and around Asia Minor, but coming as far away as Nubia in Africa, coming as far away potentially as back towards the eastern Mediterranean, from the area that we think of as being the Levant, Canaan, those types of things. It had a number of different things, as well as items from maybe as far away as Italy, perhaps as far away as Iran. All of these things are on this one vessel, which suggests that there was a very robust set of trade that was happening across the entire, if you will, sort of known world, particularly of these empires that are part of the collapse here in the late Bronze Age, these Bronze Age empires, that there was a tremendous amount of trade that was going on. It's also important to note the importance of that trade, and this is one of the things we will talk about in the collapse and the impact of the collapse, is that bronze is the result of copper and tin being combined together. Copper is not found everywhere, but it's fairly widespread and fairly easily accessible in terms of being able to be mined and to be extracted. Tin is actually, although it represents only 1/10 of what is needed to produce bronze, is far more rare. There are sources of tin that are easily accessible and that are well known in the British Isles. There are some that are in the area of parts of Italy. And then there are some that are as far away as Afghanistan. And what appears to be the case, the more that we've understood how everything interacts together in terms of this trade network, is the trading happened as a result of these cultures being stable and the result of all the benefits that existed because they were these powerful empires and cultures in the late Bronze Age, but that the trade itself was part of what drove the Bronze Age. In other words, in order to make bronze, you needed tin. Tin was not available everywhere, and so it was necessary to trade items for it. So the actual technology that's driving the Bronze Age, the bronze itself, is requiring that trade be an important part of what's happening in order to be able to have the materials to produce the bronze. And so there is a cyclical trading economy that takes place here in the late Bronze Age that requires trade in order for the materials to be brought together to produce the bronze, to produce the thing that is allowing the age to exist. And so one of the things that happens during the collapse is there's a collapse of this trading network. And so it becomes difficult for historians and archaeologists to really ascertain, did the events that led to the collapse take place and then the trade networks and the trading activity ceased as a result of that, or did something cause the trading to cease and that was another factor that led to the collapse? So it's a little bit of a circular argument about what is the cause and effect of the trade and its disruption, or the disruption of the trade causing the collapse. Did the collapse cause the disruption? Did the disruption cause the collapse? Or was it actually all of those factors working together? But what we do know is if you don't have this robust trade network that was set up that enabled all of this to happen, again, much of it represented by this one particular shipwreck that shows just how extensive and how widespread that network was. When that comes to a halt, the impact of that is pretty tremendous. And so the collapse is a collapse of many things, not just individual city-states, not just individual empires, not just individual cultures, but an entire, if you will, world economic order that has taken place. And one of the things that's often mentioned there is the fact that, in some ways, tin during that age may have served very much like modern fossil fuels, particularly oil, serves today. If oil wasn't able to flow from one location to another, if the trade didn't exist for that, the economy built around, like their modern economy is built around that petroleum resource. The Bronze Age economy was built around the trade of tin. If you couldn't trade for tin, you were no longer going to have a Bronze Age. That's an important part of what's going on there. So finally, let's talk about the causal factors for the late Bronze Age collapse, for the collapse. Well, the actual cause of the destruction seems to be, to a great degree, the people that archaeologists and historians know as the Sea Peoples. Now, who are the Sea Peoples? Well, the Sea Peoples are a confederation or a group of peoples that actually come and invade and attack the places that we've already talked about. They come to bring destruction to the areas of Anatolia, to the areas of Ugarit, to cities along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, and they fight at least two major conflicts with the Egyptians in the Nile Delta. Now, historians are not quite sure exactly who they are or where they come from. In fact, there's probably anywhere from about 8 to 10 different hypotheses, and it appears that they are not just one single group of people, but actually a collection of peoples. And we know this from some of the inscriptions that we find, for example, from the Egyptian pharaohs, particularly Ramses III, who gives a description about who some of them are by name, although archaeologists and historians are still trying to figure out what the sources of those people might be. It's possible that they come from as far away as Central Europe. They may come from parts of the Aegean or parts of the areas that we think of as being modern Greece. They could come from Sicily or Italy. They certainly manifest themselves as who we'll come to know later as the Phoenicians, but they definitely come from the sea. Now, why they are coming is also something that's a little bit of a question for historians. Are they coming simply because of conquest? Are they coming for other reasons? Or perhaps are they a form of refugees that are actually been forced to take on a military aspect because of what is happening to them, and they're actually coming to compete for resources? And so the actual destruction comes as a result of the Sea Peoples. We will spend some time talking about them as we talk about each of the individual what ifs and sort of how they interact and how they continue to be. Because at least in one element, the Sea Peoples that we come to know as the Phoenicians, later perhaps become the Philistines as well, carry on, that ultimately perhaps having an influence of becoming Carthage, other things that actually happened in the real historical what did. So part of the historical what if will also be what would happen if there were no Sea Peoples, not just what would have happened to the various empires and late Bronze Age civilizations that collapsed, but what actually took their place would not have arisen. So that's several of the what ifs that we will explore will go along those lines, and so that'll be our opportunity to talk about who the Sea People were or who they weren't in a little bit more detail. Now, I mentioned we're not quite sure what motivated them to be on the mode of conquest. But there are a number of potential factors that historians look at that may have been contributing factors to the collapse. And it's more and more the position, I think, that's being staked out now by historians and archaeologists that it was not one single cause of the collapse, but it's a combination of these factors working together and in some cases causing each other. And so I want to spend a little bit of time looking now at least at the big picture understanding of what might be the potential causes of the late Bronze Age collapse. Probably almost all of them to some degree center around, at least initially, some form of environmental cause. And so that manifests itself in the form of drought. There's a tremendous amount of evidence, a tremendous amount of scholarship that is now providing support for the concept that there were, during this period of time, some very widespread and prolonged periods of not just drought, but extreme drought. The type of drought that would make the survival by an agricultural civilization something that is very difficult to see being able to sustain itself. And as I mentioned, one of the characteristics, particularly of these late Bronze Age cultures, civilizations, and empires, was that they had perfected agriculture to a degree such that they were able to have city-states, large centralized areas of population. And so when you have the impact of drought cutting into the ability to do that, it's even more profound in its effect. And so whether that environmental change that led to the drought were just the normal patterns of short-term, medium-term, and long-term climatological change, which have happened and will continue to happen, it's a little bit unclear, but we definitely had a period of time there where there was extreme drought. One possible cause of the drought, though, might actually be something that is not directly related to climate per se, but the potential that this may have been incurred by other natural disasters. Particularly, I'm talking about volcanic activity here. There's one particular volcano in Iceland, the Hekla volcano, that may have had as many as 3 different eruptions in the period from approximately 1200 BC down to about 1050 BC and maybe a little bit later. And we know from other events like the Krakatoa event, and other events that have happened throughout history, that a large volcanic eruption, the ash that's spewed into the atmosphere, can have both short-range and near-term environmental impact, but also widespread global environmental impact. Krakatoa, the year after that, is known as the year without a summer, because as the ash cloud spread around, because of also its location near to the equator, spread around the entire globe because of wind patterns and dispersion patterns, there was a substantial decrease in the global temperature as a result of just that one event. So imagine a large-scale volcanic event occurring in Iceland that actually either very localized impact there on Europe and moving over into the area of the Mediterranean, or even more in a global sense, actually causes some of the climatological change that we've talked about here. Perhaps is the inducement for the thing that leads to drought or the inability to produce crops. And so again, one of the things that historians and archaeologists look at is the possibility that these sea peoples, let's say they derive from Central Europe, may have been driven out of Central Europe because of the impacts of either just a regular climate change that produced a drought, or the type of thing that this volcano in Iceland may have produced that caused them to need to move, to need to become essentially refugees looking for food sources. That led them into conflict with others. That conflict eventually caused them to form a confederation with others and then actually become the sea peoples that we know of from Egyptian literature and some of the other literature of some of the civilizations that were then fending off the attacks and the incursions. I'm just going to call it incursions, because if they're refugees, are they coming intentionally to settle or are they coming to intentionally to attack? And so there's a number of different factors where ecological, climatological factors may have led to the starts of things that would cause the collapse. Once that happens, ruling authorities, for example, that are accustomed to not growing their own foodstuffs, but having a population and an agricultural economy that can cause them to survive. The tension that exists between those that are living in cities that can't produce their own foodstuffs, dependent upon those who have provided that to them that no longer can. The types of things that can go on inside an empire, go on inside a culture, that can be brought on by an ecological change are also quite notable. And so there might have been an environmental impetus into what's going on here. There's some scholars that talk about over this period of time there may have been a large series of over multiple decades of increased seismic activity that potentially would tie back to this volcanic activity, where there were a large number of earthquakes. And so you have major urban centers that are hit by natural disasters in the form of earthquakes and other types of events that can also cause a disruption to society, can cause a disruption to trade inside of their individual civilizations, inside of the individual empires, and then having that spread out in a broader sense to the entire world of the Bronze Age. Another thing, again, that I mentioned here when we were talking about the importance of trade, is that once you have any of these types of things happening in local areas, so some of the climatological impacts, the ecological impacts, maybe even some of the natural disaster impacts are much more local, but once they've impacted the local scope and then that impacts this global trade network, is it no longer remains a local phenomenon. And so the earthquake activity in the Aegean, the earthquake activity perhaps that happens in Asia Minor, Turkey for example, causes things to go on in the Hittite Empire or in the Mycenaean Greek Empire, the types of things that are going on there. But once they are impacted, then their trade with Egypt, their trade with other areas of the world gets impacted. And again, in many cases you may have had a 3- and 4-fold trade scenario here where good A was traded for good B, which was traded for good C, which was traded for good D, which led back to A. So for example, your ability to get 10 may depend upon your ability to trade your thing of value for something of value for someone from someone else that you then in turn trade for your tin. Without tin, even though you have the copper, you can't produce the bronze. And so all of this works together to produce the potential for a collapse that can even come off of individual, more localized impacts that can sort of spread out through this entire network. The good news about having an interconnected global trade network is that you have an interactive and interconnected global trade network. The bad news is you have an interconnected global trade network. So if one part of that system fails, then you have the chance from that system being impeded that you can actually have a collapse. And so one of the things that historians and archaeologists talk about in a broader sense here is a broader systems collapse. And that's only the result of a system being in place, which again is both the good news, but the cutting edge of this is that it's also the bad news. There also may have been, and again, which comes first here, what's causal and what's the result of the cause, is there might have been a change in how warfare was conducted. Very much the late Bronze Age is very much the age of the chariot being the dominant weapon on the battlefield for many of these cultures. For the Egyptians, this is true for the Hittites. This is true for a great degree for the Kassites. These are civilizations that their military prowess is based upon the capabilities that exist with the chariot, which work very well with the characteristics of the Bronze Age and using bronze both as a material for the chariot itself and the type of weapons that can be used off the chariot as a weapons platform. What we do see during this period of time is apparently an alteration which appears to be the rise of infantry in such a way that was changing the nature of warfare. And this may be the result of new techniques that enabled bronze production of weapons to be done in such a way that that weapons, longer types of swords, as well as spears and other things can be brought forward for use by infantry groups, but also that there may have been the early introduction and some of the first use of iron that's also an element that's coming into play here. So it's possible that these sea peoples and the groups that they represent that are coming are not just coming seeking food, they're not just fleeing ahead of natural disasters and climatological impacts, but they may also be bringing with them the next age of weapons in the form of iron, and thus that changes the balance of power militarily and the rise of the use of infantry and different types of spear configurations and sword configurations that allow infantry to become one of the dominant modes of military force as compared to the chariot. And so again, trying to figure out what the causes are here. The cause ultimately for much of the destruction, again, the cause are the sea people. But what causes the sea people? So it's the cause of the cause that's an interesting part of what needs to be explored here. So I hope that you've appreciated and enjoyed this sort of high-level overview that will set the stage for what we're looking at as we look at the collapse. And this will be a helpful primer to sort of use as we go down the various what-if scenarios. The next episode will be one of those what-if scenarios where we will take a particular closer look at one of the civilizations that's impacted, how it collapsed, and how without the collapse, without the Bronze Age collapse, things might have been different both for that civilization and for other successor civilizations as well. As we covered during the first episode, sort of giving the background and setting up the scenario of the late Bronze Age collapse, we talked about that there were a number of different civilizations that were affected by and succumbed as part of the collapse. And so for these first couple of episodes, as we continue through the series, we're going to look at some of those individual areas and cultures that were impacted. And of course, as we do here on A Fork in Time, the purpose of this is to talk about the what if, meaning that what would have happened if some of these cultures had not been lost, which means we'll look at both the contributions that they had already made in human history, but also projecting forward what might have been had they not succumbed to the forces of the late Bronze Age collapse. It's a little tough to do this part of the series in some ways because we're going to focus on more details, and the more details that we focus on, it's a little bit difficult to figure out what level of granularity to get down to. And so some choices will be made as we go through this part of the series, getting down to a granular enough level that we can actually see things in enough detail so we can actually talk about some specific what-ifs. but also trying to not get so deep into individual cultures or individual subcultures in some cases that were impacted here that it gets confusing and gets lost. One of the challenges of this particular area in history is what we know of it and also what we don't know of it. And so many times here we will be making statements around things that historians and archaeologists believe, which have come to be corrected over time, or in some cases are only new outcomes. And so this is also what makes this a little bit difficult, a little bit different than when we're talking about more modern history and the historical what ifs. Is we're in a little bit murkier space when it actually comes to the historical what did, and that makes the historical what if a little bit murkier. The place that we're going to start, though, is something that probably is a little bit easier to grasp for most of our listeners because it's going to feel a little bit more familiar in some ways. And so what we're going to talk about today, the first major cultural collapse is going to be around Mycenaean Greece. And so when we think about Greece, most of us probably think historically back to what might be more of the classic age for Greece, the period of time when we have the rise of Athens and we have the rise of Sparta and we have the rise of the other city-states that are contesting primarily with the Persian invasions. And the things that we know from history, they are particularly the states that were in the areas that would be overcome and overrun to become part of the Roman Empire, but yet have so much influence on culture inside of the Roman Empire and otherwise as well. Or you may think of Greece in terms of Alexander the Great as the Macedonian conqueror, who in his very short lifespan but also in his very short period of time essentially expanded Greek culture by conquering most of the known world, again prior to the Roman expansion. But the period of time they're going to be focusing on here today is the late Bronze Age collapse version of Greece, which is primarily not going to be those cultures that we know so well, the later Greek cultures, but it's going to be the Mycenaean Greek culture. And so to put this in perspective, we're still talking about the same geographic area. We're still talking about the Peloponnese. We're still talking about the islands and the and the various things that make up what we think of as being Greece. And the geography there is very important. In fact, it plays into a great degree to what the Mycenaean culture becomes. But we're also talking about influences that actually stretched onto into Asia Minor. We'll talk a little bit about that, perhaps a little bit today, but probably more so when we're talking about the area that's known generally as Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And we'll talk about the interactions between the Mycenaean Greeks that lead up to the late Bronze Age collapse and some of the city-states and the other inhabitants and empires that existed in the area that we know broadly as Anatolia. We're also going to talk about what existed on the islands of Cyprus and Crete, because these civilizations also, particularly the Mycenaean Greek civilization, spread to there. What we do know about this particular age of Greek culture, and it's actually something that would also be prevalent moving down into later Greek culture, was it was very much centered around the palace. So palace rule and what was sometimes referred to as the palace economy. So again, remembering just the geography of modern-day Greece, the area known as the Peloponnese, where you have a series of islands, you have very mountainous and rocky terrain. You have the situation where it is very difficult to have a contiguous or continuous type of culture that spreads out easily over time or over space. And so what you end up having here are settlements that grow into being cities, that grow into being city-states, that are somewhat independent of each other because they're independent of each other by geography. It's not easy to connect the two together. And so while the Greeks are connected by language and by culture, they are not connected politically. They are primarily independent, as they would be later to a great degree, independent city-states that are ruled by a local monarch or a local king. And we see this, for example, expressed even in the classical Greek literature. For example, if you think about the Iliad type of scenario, Homer's epic poem, what's described there is more likely the Greece of this period, of the Mycenaean period, and there you see Menelaus and you see Odysseus and some of the other warrior kings that represent the leaders of their particular city-states, their particular regions, but there is not one overarching leader of the Greek culture or the Greek society except by military might or except by them coming into common agreement. You even see that in the story of the Iliad. Yes, they agreed to go under the command of Agamemnon, but that is a voluntary thing, and in fact, that actually becomes part of what is the story, is convincing these various kings of the various city-states to join him in this particular quest. So to the extent that that represents something historical or quasi-historical, it does sort of indicate the nature of the culture and the nature of what was there. The other interesting thing that, to me at least, that is represented by the Mycenaean culture is it very much is dependent upon art, and it is very much dependent upon trade. These particular city-states did not have vast resources independently when it came to agriculture or when it came to other things, and so they became, because they were primarily an early seafaring nation with almost all of the city-states existing on the coast, because that's pretty much all there is in the Peloponnese, is they very quickly become the traders, what was described before as being this trade network that definitely existed among the cultures and the nation states of the period before the late Bronze Age collapse, which we've talked about and will continue to talk about as we move through the series. And so these are societies and these are economies that are very built around the idea of trade, exporting their fine goods. In many cases, they were the artisans that produced the types of things that were greatly desired among the other nation states, and those were exported in return for some basic types of things, foodstuffs and other resources that didn't exist because of sort of the harsh landscape of their homeland. And so trade is a very important part of what goes on with the Mycenaean culture. We also have some very familiar things that do extend down, and that is their take on religion. And so most of what we know as being the gods of Olympus, we know of as being the Greek gods, definitely descend from and come from this period of time, from the Mycenaean age of Greece. They also were quite inventive, and so that's one of the things that we'll talk about here as we begin to slip into a what if, which is focusing on the impact that would have existed had we not lost the Mycenaean culture. Before we go into that what if, we're going to talk a little bit about the particular what dids of their collapse as part of the late Bronze Age so that we can place them in the proper timing there and understand what was lost and when it was lost so that we can continue down the path of exploring what might have been. In fact, with the Mycenaean culture, there really are 2 points of collapse to sort of center around based upon most of the current thought now that goes on with historians and archaeologists. The latter of those is more the traditional period that we talk about, the late Bronze Age collapse. That's moving down to the 10th and 11th centuries BC. But before that, there's an event that is sometimes referred to as the initial decline or the initial collapse. And that centers around something that has come to be known as the Dorian invasion. And it's important to understand that this hypothesis is still somewhat controversial, as best I can understand, among historians and archaeologists, because one of the questions is whether the quote-unquote Dorians, and it's identified as such because of the change that happens with Greek language, which then moves forward to the period that's known as the Greek Dark Ages, which is the period that's immediately after the late Bronze Age collapse, before the rise of what we think of as being classical Greece, even archaic Greece, is that there's a change in language and there's a change somewhat in the culture that is referred to here again as Doric or Dorian. And so there are 2 broad theories among historians about what happened in terms of, we can say though when it happened, and that's that this first wave of destruction probably happened roughly around 1250 BC. And it was primarily in the mainland centers there in Greece, and so the most notable would be the city of Thebes. Thebes was burned to the ground, nearby fortifications were destroyed, and this is definitely at the results of what are believed to be the Dorians, the rise of the Doric peoples, just because of what archaeologists have found after that. But there's again tremendous controversy over what was actually the cause here. Was this a migration of peoples who had been Greek to some degree or interacted with the Greeks prior to this. In fact, it's sometimes referred to as the return of the descendants of Hercules, that Hercules had been exiled and these were his descendants that were coming back, or whether these Dorians were actually a subclass inside of the Mycenaean culture who essentially had an uprising. And so something of a revolution happened inside of Mycenaean Greece at this time. Remember that we talked about the economy and the political structure was very palace-centered, very hierarchical in terms of there being a monarch. And it appears that there seem to be very few stratas or layers of the Mycenaean Greek culture. There was the palace, those that were associated with the palace, so nobles, to whatever extent that there were nobles, were actually contained within the palace itself. Obviously the king, which was a hereditary type of thing that was passed down. And then there was the rest of the population. Now those may include artisans and just the normal citizens, to the extent that you would call them citizens because they really had no right or say in the government, but just the other peoples that comprised each of these individual city-states. And something I should say here, just to maybe correct an impression that I left earlier, is that most archaeologists and historians believe that these city-state areas were a little bit larger, slightly more regional than what we find later in classical Greece, when things had gone down in many cases just to the individual city-state or the very small area around that. So there might have been some larger political structures here, but this was definitely a hierarchical structure that controlled the military. These were definitely warrior kings, where military action was a very common thing, controlled the economy through trade, and controlled the rule of the territory through this very palace-centered type of scenario. And so in this initial collapse, if it's the Dorians that are coming as an outside influence that are migrating either because of climate issues or because of other types of natural disasters or just the other things that are happening there, the availability of foodstuffs, whether they're migrating from the outside or whether they are actually those who were already there, who were uprising against the ruling class, there's a definite change that happens. And you have this period of time, particularly, again, centered around the middle of the 13th century BC, where they're particularly in Thebes, but in other areas as well, where you have destruction of these palace centers and a disruption of the society as it was known at that time. Now, what did happen shortly after that, there was a small period of time that's sort of a revival of this Mycenaean culture, but then that doesn't last long, because it's only shortly after that that there's a second wave, approximately 1190 BC. So we're talking about 60 to 70 years later, when there's another wave of destruction that is clearly seen across the entire area. And it's here that we find that there's more widespread destruction. There's more of the Mycenaean city-states, more of these particular cultural and palace centers collapse, basically to the extent that there's very little known after them for a period of time when we slip into what's known as the Greek Dark Ages. It's during this particular time that Homer's poem, the Iliad, apparently is, or whatever poem that he adapted, probably not unique to him, but this history that looks back on things like the Trojan War and the Mycenaean culture that are represented in the Iliad. It's during the Greek Dark Ages that this comes to be, when it's looking back on this previous period that was a heightened period of success for the culture, which was the Mycenaean culture. Now, it is important to note that they are known for a number of things, among those being pottery and innovations when it came to military forces, less use of the chariot, more use of infantry and foot soldiers, which would become much more important moving forward. We'll actually spend a good bit of time going through this entire series talking about the change in the nature of warfare. Before the late Bronze Age collapse, the most powerful elements of warfare were centered around chariots as being the primary means of military power. That changes during the collapse, and certainly post-collapse, where there's more emphasis that's placed upon infantry and foot soldiers and their value in military. But to some degree, the Greeks, because it was much more difficult for them in their home territories to be able to rely as heavily upon chariots as it would be for the other pre-Bronze Age collapse cultures in modern-day Turkey and Anatolia, in the Levant. So we're talking about the areas of Canaan and Israel, in Mesopotamia. It was much more terrain friendly to the use of chariots and warfare there than it was at any point in time, really, during the territory that comprises Greece, where we're talking about the Mycenaean Greece, where we're talking later about classical Greece. And so, one of the innovations, or one of the major things that the Mycenaeans had brought to the table in terms of innovation in a military sense, was more organized capabilities that were centered around the particular use of infantry, of foot soldiers. To some degree, you see this played out in the story of the Iliad, where the Trojans are very reliant upon, in fact, think about the Trojan horse, very reliant upon their use of chariots and their use of horses in warfare, while the Greeks and the stories of the heroes that are contained there of the Greeks are obviously those of heroes that are less based on the power of the chariot, more based upon the power of the spear and the lance and the sword. You can see that expressed even in the story of the Iliad, which tells a little bit about the Mycenaean culture in terms of what was there. But separate from their contributions when it came to military theory or military action, there are probably two broad areas that the Mycenaeans were most influential in. One of those would be architecture and engineering, building. They were known for building very large, massive structures. In fact, some of the structures are so large that legend said that they could not have been built by men. They must have been built by these super morphed men, the Cyclopses, the one-eyed creatures of mythology, because it would only have been a Cyclops that would have been strong enough to move and to place these large blocks. And so by the time, well before the late Bronze Age collapse, Mycenaean culture featured architectural and engineering capabilities when it came to building palaces and fortresses and other types of things that were unique. And while there are certainly other cultures that were doing this in the cultures that came before the late Bronze Age collapse, the Mycenaeans were one of the most prolific of that, particularly in that part of the known world, in that area of the Mediterranean. The other big thing that they brought to the table, and probably was most missed in the period after their decline in the late Bronze Age collapse, is that of trade. As I mentioned before, they were the artisans who brought in raw materials and then produced finished fine product goods for export, but they were also the ones very much who were involved in the moving of those goods through the sea trade. And so when we go into the period following the late Bronze Age collapse, and there's a collapse of that trade that we discussed in the previous episode, which was so vital to the interaction, to the economies that existed among these various cultures that were either lost or greatly changed as a result of the collapse. The Mycenaeans were a big part of that trade. It's important to think about as we think about the historical what if they had survived, that trade would have continued. And remember what trade brings. It not only brings the exchange of finished goods and raw goods, it's not just about the economic aspects of trade, although that is very important, is that understanding what happens as a result of trade is there's the free flow of ideas. And so once the trading economies collapse, and in this case, once there are no longer really those who are in the responsibility or undertaking the task of organizing that trade through sea trade, through sea travel, which the Mycenaeans were a big part of that prior to their collapse. What you not only have is the loss of goods being exchanged, but you have the loss of ideas being exchanged. And I think more than anything else, that's the most interesting historical what if that relates to the Mycenaean collapse, is they were part of the engine that had allowed not only the exchange of goods, but again the exchange of ideas, the exchange of culture, and the exchange of concepts. When they are lost as one of the civilizations that falls during the late Bronze Age collapse, one of the immediate results is a tremendous drawback in the amount of international trade, and with that international trade comes the sharing of ideas across the entire area of the known world. So if we had not lost the Mycenaeans, you can imagine that some of the idea exchanges which would come 3, 4, 5, 600 years later that would influence each other in the ways that they did would have continued and happened much sooner. It very much is, and I think it's interesting that historians use the term Greek Dark Ages to describe what happens to Greek culture after the fall of the Mycenaeans and before the rise of what we think was being more classical Greece. is that that period of the Dark Ages, think about what that was in Western culture in terms of how things that had been known before were lost, or the exchange of things that happened that didn't happen as frequently during the Dark Ages in Europe. The same thing happened not only in Greece, but around the area of the Mediterranean and around the area that was most impacted by the cultures of the late Bronze Age that are collapsed. And so that loss of the Mycenaean culture and the trade associated with it, economic, but also philosophical in its impact. The other thing that's there is the importance of their contribution. Most of what we know about a lot of their culture is from the fact that they did have a form of writing that was more durable and in some ways more understandable. The what's called the Linear B form of writing, and so we lose that during the period of the Greek Dark Ages, and so we lose some of the capability of recording history, and we lose some of the recorded history. And so again, without a Mycenaean collapse, related to what I just described there, related to the loss of knowledge and the loss of understanding that comes with the Greek Dark Ages, we also lost for a period of time the ability to effectively write down and capture many of the things that were going on in Greek culture and as a result in other parts of the world at that time. It is believed by most historians, most archaeologists, that there were a number of ways of writing and recording, cuneiform, for example, the things that we have in Ugaritic script, other types of things certainly existed, but we lost an element of that when we lost the Greek portion of that, the Mycenaean part. It eventually will become, most historians and scholars believe, to be what becomes part of the Phoenician explosion, and also, of course, the alphabet that gets adopted, the Phoenician alphabet. But that's much later. So we lose time, we lose track in history, and again, several centuries of losing that has a ripple effect as we move down through time. And probably the last thing that I just want to mention that relates to that is their influence on, if you will, religion. As I mentioned before, eventually the Romans would adopt essentially the Greek gods as their gods, and so the primary mode of most of the religion that would become part of the Roman Empire was influenced by Greece. And there's no doubt that the Greek understanding, the Mycenaean understanding of religion, had taken hold not only in Greece but across large parts of the Mediterranean prior to that. Certainly you had different things that were going on in the Levant, you had different things that were going on in Samaria and certainly in Egypt, but a large portion of Greece and a large portion of what would become the region known as Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, were heavily influenced by the Greek religious culture that came out of the Mycenaean period in Greece. And so that, of course, had its impact and its flow on big questions of thought when it came to who were the gods, how did things come to be. But those things logically flow out, and we see this later primarily in classical Greek culture, in how political thought, philosophical thought flows from that. Later, as in classical Greek culture, as those things are adopted, they do influence the thinking and the thoughts of folks like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, the very things that we think of as being the foundations of much Western philosophical thought, which flow out of Greece, were lost for a period of time with the fall of the Mycenaeans. And so it's interesting to contemplate the historical what if you don't have that collapse, could some of those thoughts, some of those theories have actually developed much earlier. Now you may argue that if it's not for the Mycenaean collapse, that those things don't actually come to be, because the Greece that comes to be after the Dark Ages, while being heavily influenced by its Mycenaean past, is also different than its Mycenaean past. And so it's a fair thing to say when you're talking about the historical what if here, is that while some of the things you might look at and say we could have had them earlier, they could have had more influence earlier, and the change that happens from that, some of the things that actually grow into being Greek culture that we think of Greek culture, because we tend to think more of the classic Greek culture, might not have arisen in these areas that were so ruled by monolithic rulers in a palace environment. In fact, if you think about the city of Athens, sort of being an early version or early thought about what is, sometimes referred to as democracy. In some ways, it may be an early cradle of democracy, although that form of democracy looks very different than what we think of in the modern sense of democracy. That arose only because there had been the collapse of the civilization that had existed before, which was not geared or aligned towards that development. And so, one of the actual what dids is that when Greek culture is reconstituted over time post the Bronze Age collapse, it takes many of the principles and concepts that it had from its own history and its own cultural background, but it adapts those in new ways with different structures that are in place. And some of those do definitely cause more of an emphasis upon the ordinary citizen, the ordinary member of society. In fact, if you take the concept of the Dorian invasion or the Doric collapse, I mentioned sort of that first phase of the two-phase collapse, that may be actually the first elements of that, where you have an uprising by the people that felt that they were suppressed or repressed inside of those societies, rising up and taking control of their own destiny. So that's a little background. We'll be doing this over the next few series of episodes, looking at each individual culture that's sort of here before we get into the much bigger themes of the what if. And the real prize in this, in my mind, in this particular series, are the larger themes and how they play down deeper into history. But it's important to understand the building blocks that would lead to that. So the Mycenaeans are the first of these. In the next episode, we'll actually come back and look, moving a little bit further east, to the areas that were sort of influenced and did interact with the Mycenaeans. And we're going to look at the area of Anatolia. And so there we're going to focus on the Hittites. We're going to focus somewhat on the Assyrian empires, which go through a series of phases. And that'll be the next emphasis in the series as we continue down looking at the late Bronze Age collapse.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.